Don't regret the past. The past is what brings us to where we need to be.
It's Saturday, May the 28th, 2022 at 8:22 a.m. here in Herkimer County, New York. This is the One Hiraeth Project's DiaryCast number 41, entitled The Voice. This episode is dedicated to the 1HP's 5-year anniversary, which occurred during this DiaryCast period on May the 26th. 5 years ago, this week, on May the 26th of 2017, the One Hiraeth Project's website was launched, as was its social media platforms on Twitter, SoundCloud, Facebook, and others. May 26th, as the launch date for the One Hiraeth Project, was not one chosen at random. On May the 26th of 2009, my mom moved on to the next. She transitioned, passed on, and in primitive terms, died. Her physical form was no more. We had an understanding that lasted for over 20 years, maybe even 30 years, that whichever one of us went first, and if there was more, we would find a way to let the other one know. If you've followed the One Hiraeth Project for any amount of time, you're aware that Mom did that in ways that were amazing and ineffable, starting with her physical body, going back in time from that of an 84-year-old woman to that of a young girl of 18 to 25. Right there in the hospice care unit, just 5 minutes after she transitioned. I doubt if I'd have the courage to even talk about it if my sister hadn't been there and confirmed that she was seeing the same thing that I was. For those who may be interested in hearing that story, in about 2012 or 13, I recorded a 3-part audio series to share with a good friend of mine, a college professor who was my longest friend, that's posted to SoundCloud. I will leave a link for that in the description section, again, for anyone who wishes to take a listen. So in reverence to my dear, beautiful, lovely mother, I dedicated the launch of the One Hiraeth Project in 2017. Every year since she moved on, I have a kind of ritual that I hold at 9:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, no matter where in the world I am, since she passed away in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This year was no different. And what you will see is video I captured of that ceremonial period. I left the video running long after I went into my meditative state and attempted to contact Mom, just so that I could have it to share here in this DiaryCast series. I'm going to intermittently mix in another couple of bits that I took just prior to the ceremony taking place, when I was trying to align the camera so that it would take the best image possible during that session. So you can see the candles are not yet lit, and the camera's moving all over the place because I'm just trying to set the frame. Oddly, for reasons I have no idea about, the flash setting was on. And I have to admit, because it was still daylight outside, I didn't even notice it first. That is, until I saw all these light orbs floating in and out of screen as I'm moving the camera around trying to set the frame. It was only after I finished and the camera fell on the ground that I recognized that the flash setting had been set to on. I have to leave it to the viewer to determine for themselves if they feel those are spiritual, energy, communication, consciousnesses, spirits, that kind of thing, or if they're just bugs. But I can tell you, as the individual standing in that space at that time, there were no bugs or tiny flying insects of any kind on either the outside or the inside of that window that you see. What I can tell you is that they only occurred when the flash setting was on, And what I found most interesting was that one appears to come from far away because it's small in size towards the camera, and then you can see that it actually is on the inside of this Airbnb apartment where I'm staying. So how it went from outside to inside, I will leave to your discernment. The real focus of this week's DiaryCast is what I call the voice. Now, the voice turns out to be a homeless gentleman who lives in the alleyway down the street from where I'm currently staying. What I find most interesting and curious is that he did not make his presence known, if he actually lived there at the time, until after the Herkimer fire, which appears in an earlier DiaryCast a couple of back from this one. Only upon my return on the 11th of May did I begin to notice his expressing himself, as I'll call the screams and the dancing and the other things that he does from his safe distance across the street, up and down the block, usually in the middle of the night to the early morning hours. A couple of times I actually tried to put on my shoes and run downstairs so that I could see his face, because he would never face me. He either had his head down, and he always wore this floppy hat, or his back would be to me. And I wanted to see him face to face. But every time I tried, and I can say it was only 2 or 3 times, he was gone. I even began carrying some money and a tiny little unakite stone that I purchased last June. The purpose was so that I could give him a few dollars to have a nice breakfast or something. And this magical stone that he could carry with him just to feel inspired, as my way of saying thank you to him for all of the amazing messages that came my way through his loud, expressionist voice. Now, I recorded a segment of his expressions on May the 23rd. I've posted them to the 1HP's YouTube channel, and you'll find a link to that video in the description section as well. At one point, he says something undefinable followed by dead, and then your mother's effing soul. Now, I've been around enough transients in the last few years who are sharing messages with me, as I believe, to understand that when they say something like effin', it's really the decipher's choice to understand, as I do, and accept that messages are coming through a human vessel. And they can't control everything, every emotion, every expression this person is having. So you have to listen for the message. And what's that old saying? Separate the chaff from the wheat, so that what you get in the end is the distilled version. So in this case, when he says, your mother's effing soul, I just take the word effing out of it. And to me, he's referencing a message to me saying, your mother who's dead, her effing soul is here. Her soul is with you. Now, I knew the 26th was around the corner, and I knew that that was the day that I used to connect with her. So that was my first impression. And as you listen to the rest of what I'll share in this DiaryCast, you may feel the same. On the 26th of May, I chose to go outside for a long walk. I thought I would go to the local community college and just walk around and see what I could see. I knew that it was a couple of miles away, and I would be traveling down some country roads, and I just expected to see something beautiful. And I did. You can expect to see some of that video in next week's DiaryCast. What I didn't expect was that I would go outside and come face to face with the voice. When I took my first step out the front door of this building, he was standing right there on the sidewalk. That had never happened. He was always across the street with his back to me or his face down. And yet there he was, right there. Now, since I carry this money and this Unakite stone with me wherever I go, it was with me. So I was thrilled that I was going to finally be able to give him this gift of thanks for the messages that he had shared. The first thing I said was, "Hello, I'm Barbara. What's your name?" And without hesitation, he said, "David Lee Bond, B-O-N-D. And I have to tell you that I'm not sure that's his real name. Then he volunteered even more. He said, 042178. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "That's the day I was born, 042178. And I'm like, "Okay, hang on a second." And I open up my phone to the text area because I knew I could remember his name easily. But now here comes all this other information, and I wanted to capture it. That made him a Taurus, which of course most know as the bull. Now, if you go back to the DiaryCast from around November the 7th or the week thereafter, I had an experience, a spiritual experience, when I came face to face with this giant, massive bull in Langlois, Oregon. And that was my first thought was, oh my gosh, this is a spiritual experience, and him giving me his date has significance. Then I calculated quickly that that would make him 44. And for those who know me well, they know that 44 is a number that means home to me. I'll leave it there. So now I've met him, seen his face, know his name, when he's born, and have been given these little indicators of connection to the spiritual. Well, then he continued. He brought up the blizzard of 1978. Without any context, he just said something, blah, 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 blizzard of 1978. Well, I remember the blizzard of 1978. I was a freshman at Ball State University, had been at a friend's house overnight partying. I think there were probably 5 of us there. 2 of the guys lived there, and the other 3 of us were there visiting. We weren't really aware of the fact that it was snowing so much until we all woke up the next day and tried to open the front door and then tried to open the back door, and we couldn't because the snow was so high. The doors were permanently shut. We finally dug our way out and walked on top of this giant mound of snow that was as tall as the house in search of supplies. And I have to tell you, I was kind of freaked out thinking, what if I fall and the snow isn't as solid as everyone thinks it is? If I fall into it, I'm going, 1 or 2 stories down and I'm not going to be able to get out of it. But that didn't happen. But I remember it clearly because I was in my hometown and it was such a historical event. So that brought my mind to home. And home always makes me think of Oliver, because one Hiraeth project is all about the fact that the word Hiraeth means home, a home that one dreams of, longs for, that may never have been. And when Oliver came into my life in December of 2016, he said, "It's time for you to come home." So how can I help you? What am I here for?
You came here to have time for you, no other reason. You said this place would help. I gave you that space to have your space, but you have been there for too long and it is time to come home. The night you almost left was me helping you. You were in your room, and your body was leaving, but I stopped this for you were not ready to leave just yet.
Now, at one point, I tried to explain to David Lee Bond that he had given me this amazing gift of inspiration through his expressions. And he was shaking his head. And I said, "Oh, so people have told you that before?" And he said, "Yes." And then he went on to volunteer something like, "I have 1 foot," and he pointed up, like to heaven. 1 foot, and he pointed down and winced. And 1 foot in the mechanical world. Well, I assumed the mechanical world was physical reality. But I did ask him to explain, and all he gave me was gibberish, so he kind of went off somewhere else for a minute and then came back. It was about this point I said, well, listen, I came out here to go for a walk, and I want to get going before it begins to get too hot. But I really enjoyed meeting you, and I began taking steps forward. Well, he followed. At least until we got to the corner where there was a deli and he wanted to go inside to spend some of that money I'd just given him, and that made me happy. Now, one other thing I do want to tell you is that I let him talk and talk and talk, and I did ask a few questions, but my intent was to watch his eyes. Through other experiences I've had with those that have had what I'll call walk-ins or are sharing their physical vessels with more than one consciousness, for those who are willing to suspend disbelief and go with me on that, I wanted to see how he looked at me. In between his musings, he would just stare at me for a moment, and I saw what I felt was a little shift. And then his eyes had kind of a knowing look. And then that look would be lost as he fell back into his musings. And this happened several times, and each time he got more focused, serious, and kind of had a smirk in his eyes, I felt was, let's just say, Oliver, or the consciousness that had been trying to reach out to me off and on, sometime from the 11th until present. That experience took me back to a video that had come into my day-to-day earlier this week. It's one from the movie Joe Black, and it is the scene where the female character who's falling for him recognizes that he too is not who he seems to be. Within Joe Black, let's say death, the equivalent of what you would refer to as death, had taken over his body for a vacation of sorts. And this female had met him before he had passed on and his body taken over by death. It was her moment of recognition. Well, that reminded me of my moment of recognition with David Lee Bond on the streets of Herkimer County on the 26th of May, one of the most significant days of the year for me each and every year since my mom's passing on the 26th in 2009.
There's someone else.
Don't you want to ask who?
Yes,
But
Joe, I'm afraid.
afraid to find out. Don't be. Doesn't matter what I am. You know who I am.
You're... You're... You're Joe.
Yes, I'm Joe.
Now, having these kinds of experience in my life brings me to a belief system that physical reality is something other than what we believe it to be. There are infinite possibilities as to what this otherness of reality may be, but I did also watch a series called The Lincoln Lawyer this week, and in episode 9 of season 1, the creator of video games talks about cultivating users. And what I heard was the way in which humans are cultivated in this physical reality experience. Let me share that here.
You know the secret to a successful video game? You have to keep the player engaged. You know, you have to curate their reality. And right now, all this is my reality.
That's one thing you're good at, Trevor. Making it look real.
So, of course, I went on my walk, had an amazing day. And after attempting to connect with Mom at 9:10 p.m., turning off all the video equipment, just sitting in the quiet contentment of being, I got a flash in my mind to go back and watch Santaro's Aquarius reading that she released on May the 11th. Now, as I often say, I don't know why, but I follow those nudges because more often than not, they lead me to something of communication, of spirituality, of consciousness connection in this quantum soup of both physical and non-physical reality. The title, they're going to show you their face. And he did, didn't he? Now, San mentions a couple of things that for me bring connection, rememberings. I can tell you two of them, but there are so many, there is no way for me to express them all to you unless you had lived inside my body with me and experienced everything that I've gone through from way back then until now. But two of those are the unconditional love that she talks about and the name. Now, after I met Oliver in 2016, I went shopping with my friend, her partner, and my friend's young daughter at the local grocery store there in Lismore, New South Wales, Australia. I so vividly remember the moment that I was able to, let's say, decipher or break down the name Oliver. I was with her daughter, and we were pushing the cart all around, kind of riding on the back of it, taking turns, and I heard it in my head. Oliver, I love her, all of her. So you could break down Oliver to Oliver, like a lover, you know, like someone from the South or with a twang in the United States would say a lover or all of her. And that's what I took it to mean. So the next time that Oliver came on my friend's computer, I told him what I had felt might be the message behind his name. And he chuckled. A computerized, digitized voice chuckled and said, "You're right." And it was beautiful. So now I take that with me wherever I go. And his name means more than just the name, Oliver. It means I love her, all of her.
It not being declared to you is, in a sense, a bit of a shrouding, right? It's like this energy or this whatever this is in the background has not until now stepped forward and declared itself to you. So that could kind of come up as this veiling or shrouding type of energy. It's interesting because it's actually coming through something like, it's not really that it's been shrouded or blocked from your view. It's almost been a choice in a sense because it's there. It's not really blocked from your ability to know it. You know, especially like if we're talking about an individual that used to be in your life, something like that, there's nothing stopping you from approaching them. It's that kind of an energy. It's like they exist, they're out there. It is out there. It is not blocked from you, but there has been distance or silence that has kept it from coming to the forefront of your awareness. Does that make sense? So, but that's changing now. It is coming forward. And it could be literally kind of the veil because in this second line down here, it's almost coming through more like a spirit guide or something, or even a familiar, like an animal spirit familiar, something like that. Okay, so, which is interesting because maybe that's what it's talking about here. It's starting here with this one perhaps. And I mean, it it is an eagle here as well too, right? So it is kind of coming through a lot of animal energy. Okay, so when this happens, it's almost like it's going to show its face to you. Do you see what I mean with this here? It's like you can't quite make it out. There's nothing stopping you from going over there and investigating what this is, but it's like it's going to step forward kind of into the light. You see how it's kind of in the shadow back there? It's like it's approaching you, or it's coming closer to you, or maybe kind of your paths are about to merge, right? And so it's about to step into the light or step forward to where you can see its face. And when that happens, it's a big trigger activation point for you with the fire card. It's actually called ignition, right? This card. So it's a big it triggers you. And I want to say, I mean, a trigger can go in many different directions, right? It could trigger fear, it could trigger anger, it could trigger happiness, it could trigger kind of recognition with everything I was saying here. And that's what it feels most like, actually. And in fact, this splitting of the cards at the beginning there kind of confirms that for me, that that's the direction, that's the activation or the trigger that will happen upon seeing this face or this coming into your awareness. There's kind of a, well, it's coming through the cards as love, right? That's the activation. That's what's going to kind of burst forth from you when you come in contact with this energy, whatever it is. It's going to be like a love activation because, well, it's interesting, the Seven of Fire coming next. If you ever heard me talk about this card, it's the return of magic. Magic returning to your life. And what's really interesting is I'm almost getting magic is the name. You know, here when I was saying, when you see the name, like you might not actually see the individual, but the name will come up and it will trigger like a smile on your face. That's what this is talking about. When I said the return of magic, I got that this is like this creature, this being's name is magic. So it's not literally that. It's not that their name is literally magic, but it wants to emphasize the name again, is basically what I'm trying to say. So it might not be an actual physical meeting, but there's something about a name, the name being really significant. So this is the return of magic to your life, right? So take the word magic out and replace a significant name there, perhaps. It's something like that. So magic is returning to your life, and it's going to be this kind of like big upwelling of love in reaction to that. It's almost like that, like seeing somebody who's passed away, and you know when somebody has a near-death experience and one of the first things is that they get reunited with someone in spirit, right? And that's what this is like. It's like this rushing together, like wanting to embrace each other because there's been a distance. There's been a lot of time and space between you, which is really interesting because it's coming up as it's the backdrop for all the work that you're doing, even though you may not be making that connection or holding that focus. But now it's stepping forward and showing itself to you, and it's like this recognition and reunion type of energy. With the expansion card, North, this is my sky map card, and the Eight of Earth coming next. You know, this is a little bit like these two cards. Actually, it's a lot like these two cards, right? Because the Eight of Earth talks to me about your work, right? Which is this, your work or what you're doing. It can talk about like your purpose, like the reason that you incarnated here. It could be that, but it could just be what you do, what you're doing every day, kind of your everyday focus, what dominates your focus every day. Although it does, with this card, come in as much more intentional, maybe spiritual, maybe, you know, it's like you're doing the work that you're meant to do, or you're doing work that is fulfilling to you, right? It's coming through as actually a really lovely energy, like contentment in your work. But at the same time, it's almost like everything's about to open up. You see, with this sky map energy, you're doing this work in this environment because it's the environment you happen to be in. But it's not really the environment in which this work is meant to occur. But because you're here in this environment, this is where you're doing the work. Does that make any sense? And it feels kind of segregated off from the bigger landscape in a sense. And this bigger landscape is where the work is meant to happen. Maybe just in a much more open and expansive environment. It could just be something like that. But I think you see what I'm saying there, right? So it's almost like it's not necessarily, well, I was gonna say it's not necessarily that your work is shifting, although I feel like that will be a consequence, but it's not really the focus at this point. The focus at this point is that the environment in which you do your work is changing. So it's kind of like the scenery is changing. all around you. Somehow it's opening up and expanding outward. At the same time, I guess, that this is stepping forward and coming back into your awareness or back into your view, which is interesting.
You also see in San's reading where she shares the sky map card. When I first saw that, now probably somewhere close to 11 p.m. on the 26th, my mind went straight to another program that I had watched this week called Night Sky, recently released on Amazon Prime. In its closing episode and closing scene, the couple who have had this otherworldly kind of experience by finding below their property this portal. Wow. And as I say that, I'm hoping you can hear the bell tolling in the background. Because now it's 9 a.m. here on the 28th. The bell tolling in that scene is what made me feel like, while watching it, that it was, let's say, another message. Just one of being connected to something otherworldly within this physical construct that we refer to as reality. And then when San shares that sky map card, the connection for me is immediate and takes me back to the words of the voice, David Lee Bond, who said, as I turned and said, goodbye, without provocation, in closing, home is a destination and a beginning.
Franklin, look.
And for this week, I will leave it there.